Hotel Maid stops billionaire from signing deal that would have killed thousands. Hey, beautiful souls. Your support absolutely lights up my world. That little subscribe button, it's pure magic for our growing family and brings you more heartwarming stories. Here's my promise. I personally answer every comment because you matter to me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm genuinely excited to connect with you. Ready for today's extraordinary tale? Let's dive in together. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel commanded the San Francisco skyline like a floating palace of light. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured rainbows across marble floors, so polished they seemed to hold the city's reflection. Silicon Valley's titans moved through the space with practiced grace, their conversations a symphony of mergers and billions, their laughter sharp as cut glass. Designer silk rustled against Italian leather, while champagne bubbles rose like tiny prayers toward the vaulted ceiling. At the room's heart, Jonathan Pierce sat alone, despite being surrounded by dozens. The mahogany table beneath his hands had been carved from a tree older than the nation itself, its surface now bearing witness to history's making. His empire sprawled across continents like a digital nervous system. His name whispered in boardrooms where lesser men's fortunes were decided with the casualness of ordering coffee. Tonight, with Mont Blanc pen poised above parchment, he would add another chapter to his legend, a pharmaceutical deal worth $100 million that would cement his place among America's untouchable elite. The contract lay spread before him, its pages thick with the arcane language of lawyers and the poetry of profit margins. Legal clauses twisted through subsections like ivy through a garden gate, each paragraph a promise of astronomical returns. Around him, investors leaned forward with the hunger of wolves, their breath held in collective anticipation. This wasn't merely business. This was alchemy, the transformation of ink on paper into power itself. But Jonathan Pierce remained unaware that his entire existence balanced on the edge of a whisper from a woman the room had rendered invisible. Sarah Mitchell moved between the tables like morning mist, seen but never truly observed, present but never acknowledged. For 3 years, she had haunted these halls as the hotel's phantom, cleaning rooms where million-dollar deals were conceived, changing sheets that had witnessed the dreams of industry titans, serving at galas where her year's salary wouldn't cover a single bottle of wine. The wealthy elite looked through her as if she were made of glass, their eyes sliding past her black uniform to focus on more important things. But Sarah had not always been invisible. Once, she had burned bright as a star, her with calculus homework and quoted Shakespeare over breakfast. Begin its cruel retreat into silence. The medical bills descended like locusts. Insurance covered fragments while the family's savings evaporated like morning dew. Sarah faced the choice that breaks thousands of young Americans each year: pursue her dreams or save her family. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Tonight, as she moved through the ballroom's periphery with practiced invisibility, something snared her attention like a fisherman's hook. The contract lay partially open beneath Jonathan's hovering pen, and there on page 47, a molecular formula glared up at her with devastating familiarity. Her blood turned to winter in her veins. The chemical compound was wrong, not slightly off, not questionably structured, but catastrophically, dangerously wrong. This wasn't a typo that spell check had missed or a minor error that peer review would catch. If this medication reached market with this formula, it wouldn't merely fail clinical trials. It would become a weapon disguised as healing. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down her water pitcher, the crystals singing a soft note of protest. Patients desperate for recovery would trust this medicine with the faith of the dying. Instead of restoration, they might face organ failure, cascading through their bodies like dominoes. Instead of hope, seizures that would steal their remaining moments of clarity. Instead of life, something infinitely worse. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat into her comfortable invisibility, to remain the ghost she had always been. Who was she to question a billionaire? What authority did a hotel maid possess in this cathedral of power? Her voice would be less than a whisper against the hurricane of money and influence surrounding that table. But then, her father's face materialized in her memory. trusting and vulnerable in his hospital bed, placing faith in doctors and medications that promised what they might not deliver. She saw her mother's eyes, still beautiful but increasingly empty, as they relied on treatments the family couldn't afford but couldn't live without. Behind them stood thousands of other families, other patients who would place their desperate faith in this flawed medicine. Jonathan's pen descended toward the signature line like an executioner's blade. Sir. Sarah's whisper barely disturbed the air between them, softer than the champagne bubbles breaking against crystal rims. That formula is wrong. The ballroom transformed into a photograph, every conversation freezing mid-syllable, every gesture caught between intention and completion. Even the classical quartet in the corner seemed to stumble over their notes. 100 pairs of eyes swiveled toward this young woman in her simple black uniform who had dared to speak truth into their palace of pretense. Jonathan's steel-gray eyes snapped upward to meet hers with the force of winter lightning. For a heartbeat, Sarah wanted to dissolve, to take back her words and flee back into the safety of invisibility. But conscience had torn away that sanctuary forever. "Excuse me?" Jonathan's voice sliced through the silence like a blade through silk. Sarah's courage wavered like a candle in wind, but her sense of right and wrong pushed her forward into the storm. "The molecular structure on page 47, sir. The compound is unstable. It won't bind properly to cellular receptors. Instead of treating the condition, it could cause severe neurological damage." The room erupted into chaos. Board members scoffed with the indignation of kings challenged by peasants. Investors muttered angrily about delays and the audacity of the help. Someone's voice rose above the others, demanding security, remove this delusional maid who had clearly forgotten her place in the natural order of things. But Jonathan raised his hand, and silence fell like a curtain. Something in Sarah's voice, a familiar ring of passionate certainty, reminded him of a younger version of himself, someone who had once cared about more than quarterly reports and profit margins, someone who had believed business could be a force for good rather than merely a machine for accumulating wealth. "You're saying this medicine could hurt people?" His question emerged quietly, cutting through the room's tension. Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes like morning dew. "Yes, sir. I studied biochemistry at Stanford before life happened. This formula, if it's approved, could cause irreversible brain damage in patients already fighting for their lives." The atmosphere crackled with electricity. Board members demanded immediate signing, threatening to abandon the deal entirely. Lawyers whispered frantically about liability and the cost of delays. Money itself seemed to hang in the balance, waiting for Jonathan's decision. But Jonathan found himself studying this young woman who had risked her livelihood to speak truth to power, who had chosen the welfare of strangers over her own security. "Get our research team on the phone," Jonathan commanded, his voice cutting through the protests like a sword. Now. What followed was a 6-hour odyssey through the valley of scientific truth. Teams of researchers and independent laboratories worked through the night with the urgency of emergency room doctors. Investors grew furious, some storming out with threats and curses trailing behind them like smoke. Pharmaceutical executives threatened lawsuits and demanded immediate signing, their voices growing shriller as the hours passed. But as dawn painted San Francisco Bay in shades of gold and rose, the verdict arrived like morning light itself. Sarah was right. The formula contained a flaw so fundamental it could have injured or killed thousands of innocent people. The deal died with the sunrise, $100 million evaporating like mist. But for the first time in 20 years, Jonathan Pierce felt something more valuable than wealth pooling in his chest, the forgotten warmth of purpose. As the last angry investor departed, Jonathan found Sarah in the conference room, quietly stacking chairs as if nothing earth-shaking had occurred. She moved with the same invisible grace she had always possessed, as if saving lives was simply part of her job description. "You saved countless lives tonight," he said softly. Sarah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and emotion, but still holding that spark of intelligence that no amount of hardship could extinguish. "I just did what was right, Mr. Pierce. Sometimes that's all we can do." Jonathan learned her story in the quiet hours that followed. The sacrificed dreams, the 3 jobs, the medical bills that stretched toward the horizon like an endless desert. But instead of pity, he felt inspiration blazing in his chest. Here was someone who had lost everything while pursuing an education to help others. Even when reduced to cleaning hotel rooms, she had chosen to protect strangers over her own security. That night changed everything. Jonathan established the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, providing full scholarships for students forced to abandon their education due to family medical crises. He restructured his entire business empire, focusing on ethical investments and life-saving technologies rather than pure profit accumulation. But most importantly, he offered Sarah something no one had given her in years: a second chance wrapped in hope. Full tuition to complete her degree, a guaranteed position in his company's research division, the resources to pursue her dream of developing life-saving medications, the opportunity to transform her whispered courage into a career of healing. 5 years later, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood before the FDA as they approved her breakthrough Alzheimer's treatment, a medicine that could slow the progression of the disease that had stolen her mother's memories like a thief in the night. As she watched her mother's eyes focus with recognition for the first time in months, Sarah remembered that night in the hotel ballroom when a whispered truth had not only saved lives, but restored dreams she had thought were lost forever. And Jonathan Pierce, watching from the observation gallery with tears in his steel-gray eyes, realized that the most profitable deal he had ever made wasn't worth $100 million. It was worth something far more precious: the investment in human potential and the wisdom to listen when angels whisper. The most powerful voices often emerge from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a whisper can indeed change the world.